So we're going to draw different types of membranes. There are two major types of membranes we could have: epithelial membranes and connective tissue membrane. There are 3 epithelial membranes and 1 type of connective tissue membrane. The first type of epithelial membrane is a cutaneous membrane, which is nothing more than your skin. The second type of epithelial membrane is a mucus membrane. And the third and final type of epithelial membrane is a serous membrane. And then the one and only type of connective tissue membrane is a synovial membrane. And we're going to draw and describe each one of these. We'll start with the cutaneous membrane. We're going to draw this picture. It's going to look very familiar to you. Because we're doing epithelial membranes, you're going to see the same things we saw when we drew epithelial tissue. We have connective tissue at the base, and then a basement membrane right below where we're going to draw our epithelial cells. Because this is skin, you remember that skin is composed of stratified squamous epithelium that is keratinized. So the very top cells are not going to have nuclei. They're going to be dead, and they're going to be sloughing off. They're not going to look anchored to the rest of the tissue. So let's label this upper portion. So this is our stratified squamous portion. And then as you get to the top, these are your dead cells. These are keratinized. Let's dive into a little bit of the detail for the connective tissue. Connective tissue, as you remember, is composed of different cells and different fibers. Well, in this particular tissue, we have collagen. And if you remember back to your different fibers, collagen is a very thick fiber, and its function is protection. It's very strong fiber, very, very thick and strong. So this particular membrane is composed of epithelia and connective tissue. And that's not going to be true for all of these membranes. Let's move on to our mucus membrane. So the mucus membrane is going to begin just as we saw with the cutaneous membrane. We're going to have a connective tissue base and a basement membrane. On top of that, we're going to see pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So let's draw the epithelial portion. The epithelial portion is going to have columnar cells that will appear stratified, but in reality, they are not stratified. Every columnar cell aligns at the basement membrane. Every single columnar cell is anchored to the basement. So this is pseudo-stratified, not truly stratified. In addition, let's signify our goblet cell. The goblet cell is going to produce and secrete mucus. And that's going to give us a layer of mucus on top of these cells, which allows for protection, catching of debris, and then the body will use the cilia to sweep that area clean and clear of the dust and debris. We find these membranes in the respiratory tract, and we find
simple columnar epithelium in the GI tract. Pseudostratified is in the respiratory tract.
This tissue lines passageways that open to the outside environment. So if you think about your respiratory tract, that entire tract opens to the outside environment. Your GI tract, that entire passageway opens to the external environment. And that's why we require mucus, so that we catch and trap debris. That's why we need cilia, so we can catch and trap and sweep away the debris.
And finally, that layer of mucus allows for lubrication to moisten areas.
Let's do our third and final epithelial membrane. This one is serous.
Unlike mucous membranes, serous membranes line areas that do not open to the external environment.
We find this around organs such as the heart, that's the pericardium, around the lungs, that's the pleura, and we find it in the abdominal cavity, and that's the peritoneum. So none of these locations are going to be open to the external environment. All of these are covering over organs, and that's going to be a key difference between the serous membrane and the mucous membrane. The mucous membrane is going to line passageways that open to the external environment, and the serous membrane is not going to do that. It's going to line organs or the abdominal cavity. Now, unlike the other two membranes we just talked about, the skin and the mucous membranes, this is going to be composed of two layers, a parietal layer and a visceral layer. And you might remember that back from chapter 1, when we did an overview and learned about the parietal and visceral layers. So we're going to have two layers here. We're going to have one layer of connective tissue and a basement membrane, and then we're going to have another layer of connective tissue and a basement membrane. And that one is going to be situated on top of the other ones. This is going to look very different from anything we've drawn before. So that's our connective tissue, and that's our connective tissue. And then this is our basement membrane. So let's label them so we understand where we are. Connective tissue, basement membrane, and basement membrane. And then situated on top of them, because remember we always have epithelial cells that are anchored to basement membranes, we have those as well. So we have simple squamous epithelium, and those cells have a nucleus. So these cells are simple squamous. Shade them in so we can differentiate them. Simple squamous, simple squamous. And then lastly, in between these two layers, we find a layer of serous fluid. And that, of course, is the reason we name this membrane serous. So serous fluid is in here, and what serous fluid does is it acts as a shock absorber. It's a protective substance to absorb shock. Each one of these layers is a portion of the layers around the lungs, the heart, and the peritoneum, as we described. This is the parietal layer, and this is the visceral layer. And if you remember back to chapter 1, the visceral layer is the layer that sits on the organs, actually anchors to the organs. And then the parietal layer is the one that is lining the cavity. So this lines the cavity, and this one lays on the organ. So the last membrane is called a synovial membrane, and this one is very different from any of the ones we just drew, because this membrane is comprised of only connective tissue. This membrane will contain no epithelial tissue at all. We find this lining the joints. So this one is going to have a layer of connective tissue and another layer of connective tissue, but no basement membrane. Because remember, if we're not talking about epithelial tissue, then there wouldn't be a basement membrane there. So this is all connective tissue. So we have cells that are on top of this connective tissue layer, and they are fibroblast-like cells. They're similar to fibroblasts. They look very similar to fibroblasts. And their job is to secrete a special type of fluid. That fluid is called synovial fluid. That fluid is situated in here, in between these two connective tissue layers. So these fibroblast-like cells will produce the synovial fluid in between those two connective tissue layers. And those are the four membranes that we have. Cutaneous is going to be comprised of epithelial and connective tissue. That's the first one we drew. Cutaneous will be comprised of epithelial and connective tissue. The mucous membrane will line passageways that open to the external environment. They line the respiratory tract, that's the picture we drew. And if they line the GI tract, it will look similar to that, only they're non-ciliated. They have goblet cells, which are producing mucus, and that's going to trap dirt and debris and keep the areas moist. Then we have serous membrane, that's the third and final epithelial membrane. Those are membranes that will line structures that are not open to the external environment. And they are composed of parietal and visceral layers. So we see both of those layers here. The visceral layer, remember, lines the organs, and the parietal layer lines the walls. And then finally, the fourth and final membrane is connective tissue only. It's called synovial, and it lines our joints. Fibroblast-like cells will secrete that synovial fluid between both of the layers. And that synovial fluid will act as a shock absorber.